Hi there. So welcome to Module 5, Overheads and Absorption Costing. Now this is also one of the key modules that you have to understand well in relation to management accounting, because it's going to play a lot of role and you're going to need overhead absorption rates, especially when you're doing short-term decision making, or when even you are doing some issues about variance analysis and then budgeting. So it's a module that you have to understand very well in order to become successful in this examination. So the objective of this model is that at the end of the day, you should be able to explain the various types of overheads. I've already explained the various types of overheads to you. That is talking about indirect material, indirect labor, indirect expenses, talking about production overheads, administration overheads, finance overheads, selling overheads, distribution overheads. These are the various types of overheads we explain under classification of cost. Then you should be able to prepare overhead analysis sheet and reapportionment of overheads of service costs to other departments. Then you should be able to understand the apportionment of overheads using the various overhead absorption rates. And then you should make entries into the various overheads accounts. So when we talk about overheads, you know about overheads from classification of cost already, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But overheads is simply the summation of all indirect costs. So indirect material costs, indirect labor, indirect expenses. These can be sub-categorized into production overheads, selling and distribution overheads, administration overheads, or maybe finance overheads. So these are what overheads it's about. But when we are talking about how overheads are treated, there are two schools of thoughts that we have to borrow. That is how overheads can be accounted for in the financial statement or in the cost accounting statement of the organization. There are two schools of thoughts, which is the absorption costing and marginal costing. Now, the absorption costing principle is simply a method for sharing overheads between different products on a fair basis. So absorption costing is simply that, all right, if we have various products that we are producing or we have various activities that we are undertaking in the organization, how do we share the overheads among these various products? So for instance, if we are producing 3 products and we are incurring an overhead cost for selling and distribution of 5,000, on what basis do we share to these 3 products? That is basically what absorption costing is about. But there are 3 practical reasons why absorption costing is used, because in absorption costing, what we're going to do is that we are going to charge all costs that relates to the production of the products. But under marginal costing, you are going to be separating the cost into fixed and variable. I'm going to explain that also in the next module, but get a basis here as a down payment. In marginal costing, we just categorize the cost into production cost and non-production cost. So all the cost that relates to the products, all the cost that relates to the inventory, we add it to the cost, whether it is fixed or it is variable. Then all the cost that doesn't relate to the production of the products, we treat it as non-production overheads. But under marginal costing, we don't do that. What we do is that we separate the cost into fixed cost and variable cost, so that we will get contribution less the fixed cost from the contribution, then we will get a net profit for the organization. So there are 3 practical reasons why the absorption costing principle is used. 1, during inventory valuation. Because with the absorption costing, we are able to include all costs into the inventory, whether it is fixed or variable. Once it relates to the cost of the inventory, cost of the production of the products, we relate it there. Unlike absorption costing, we only include the variable cost in the production of the product, and we classify the cost. All fixed costs are not included in the production of the products, but that is not done in absorption costing. 2, it's about pricing decision. If you want to determine the actual cost of your product so that you can determine the price that you want to charge for the product, then you must take into consideration the total cost that you incurred in the production of the product. That is why absorption costing is used, so that we know the total cost we incurred in the production of the product, both fixed and variable. And then the third thing is establishing the profitability of different products. So these are the practical reasons why absorption costing must be used. But also IAS 2, that is Accounting Standard 2, requires that all inventories should comprise those costs which have been incurred in the normal course of the business in bringing the inventory to their present location and condition. As such, in disclosing the closing inventory in the financial statement of the company, we must look at the actual cost of the inventory. We must take into consideration all the costs that we incurred in bringing the inventory, both fixed and variable. That is why absorption costing has to be used in the valuing of overheads and allocation of inventories in that case. Now, absorption costing goes through 3 stages, or there are 3 stages involved when we are using the absorption costing. The first one is allocation of overheads, second one is absorption of overheads, and then the third one is apportionment of overheads. When we say allocation of overheads, what do we really mean? Allocation is simply the process by which a whole cost items is charged direct to a cost center or cost unit. So an allocation of overhead simply means, for instance, if we buy raw materials, the raw materials was bought for the production department, so we charge the cost of the raw material issued to production into production department. So that is allocation of cost. If we pay our employees in the production department or the production manager, it relates to the production department, so we charge that cost to the production department. That is allocation of cost. If we pay our accountants, if you pay our administrators, if we pay our management their salaries and emoluments, what is going to happen is that we will charge that to administration because it relates to the day-to-day running of the organization. That is what we mean by allocation of cost. Then the second thing is overhead apportionment. Overhead apportionment is simply the procedure whereby indirect costs are spread fairly between cost centers in an organization. So when it comes to overhead apportionment, there are various bases for apportioning overheads. So for instance, cost of machine can be, when we want to apportion depreciation on the assets of the company, we can apportion it using cost or value of the machine. Then if you want to also value or apportion depreciation, building insurance, rent and rates, electricity cost, clearing or cleaning cost also, we can use what we call the floor area occupied. Then if we want to apportion costs such as canteen cost, personal administration and welfare or supervision cost, we can apportion that using the number of employees. Now, what do I mean by all these things? For instance, the organization has more than one department. So let's say Department A, Department B. Then in the whole week, we incurred a canteen cost of, let's say canteen cost of, let's say, $300. So in the whole week, the canteen cost for the organization was $300. But we need to apportion, we need to share that $300 to the various departments. So on what basis will we share the canteen cost? Definitely, it will depend on the number of employees that are in each of the departments. So let's say Department A has 10 employees and Department B has 20 employees. So this is what we mean by apportionment of overhead, the sharing of overheads or spreading of overheads fairly between cost centers or cost units. So if we want to share this cost, it means that the canteen cost will be apportioned as follows. For the Department A, it's going to be 10/30 by 300. So that is going to give us 10/30 by 300. So 1/3 of 300, I think that should be 100. And certainly Department B is going to take 200. All right, I should have even known that straight up. So that is what we mean by apportionment of what? Overhead. So if it is a canteen cost, we are going to use the number of employees or the number of meals served at each department. Also, if it is about electricity bill, okay, the whole electricity bill for the organization, it's let's say $300. how are we going to share electricity bill? We will share electricity bill based on the number of lights that is being used in Department A and Department B, or the kind of machines that are used by each of the department. These are what we refer to as apportionment of overheads. So let's look at an illustration on how we can calculate the cost per unit in an organization, taking into consideration the idea of overheads. We are told that X PLC produces desks and chairs in the same factory. Each desk uses 3 kilograms of wood at a cost of $4 per kilogram and takes 4 hours to produce. Each chair uses 2 kilograms of wood at a cost of $4 per kilogram and it takes 1 hour to produce. Labor is paid at a rate of $2 per hour. Fixed costs of production are estimated to be $700,000 per annum. The company expects to produce 30,000 desks and then 20,000 chairs per annum. Overhead are absorbed on labor basis, right? So even though we've not got to that place yet, we still have to do the workings in this case. So let's look at how we will prepare the cost card for the organization. Now, the overhead, the total overhead incurred in the organization relates to the fixed production cost. We are told it's 700,000. Now, that 700,000 is the total factory cost. But in the factory, we are producing 2 products, desks and chair. So the question is, how do we share that 700,000? We're going to share that 700,000 between the chair department and then the the desk department, chair department, and then the desk department. On what basis do we share that? The examiner has told us that overhead is absorbed based on what? Labor hour basis. So it will be dependent on the total labor hours that has been used by each of these departments in the organization. So let's see how that goes. So we are told that the total factory overheads is 700,000 in the question. Then we need to get a total labor hours that is used in the organization so that we can get the overhead absorption rate. So we are told from the question that the company has a budget of producing 30,000 desks, and each desk is going to take 4 hours. So for the desks, it's going to take 30,000 desks times 4 hours per desk. So 30,000 by 4, that should be 120,000 hours. Then for the chairs, we are told from the question that we are going to produce 20,000 chairs. And we are told that 20,000 chairs, each chair takes an hour. And so that's going to be 20,000 hours. So the total hours is going to be 140,000 hours. So we are told that overhead is apportioned based on the labor hours. So we need to get what we call the overhead absorption rate. So we will use that overhead absorption rate to now apportion the total overheads. So overhead absorption rate is going to be, the total overhead incurred, 700,000. This is one of the bases of apportionment of overheads, divided by the labor hours, and that is going to give us $5 per hour. $5 per hour. So 700,000 over 140,000, that will give us $700 per hour. So based on the $700 per hour, the question will be, how do we now calculate the cost of the chair and then the cost of the desks in the organization, and how do we even absorb these overheads into the products? So let's put chair on one side and let's put desks on the other side. So desks, let me bring it a little bit closer. Desks, chairs. We are told in the question that the per unit of desk is 3 kilograms of wood costing $4 per kilogram. So that is going to be material. So material will be 3 kilograms by 4 and that's going to be 12. For the chair, we are told 2 kilogram costing $4 per kilogram. So that's 2 kg by $4, and that is going to be 8. Then the labor cost. We are told in the question that the chair or the desk uses 4 hours to produce 1 desk, but the rate per hour is $2. So 4 hours by $2, that's going to be 8. For the chair uses 1 hour by $2, and so that's going to be 2. Then we ask ourselves, what is the overhead? Okay, what's the overhead? We are told in the question that overhead is absorbed based on the labor hours. So we calculated the overhead absorption rate as $5 per hour. So in that case, it's going to be $5 by the hours used by the desk, which is what? 4 hours. And so that's going to be 20. And then for the chair, they used 1 hour by $5, and that's going to be 5. So at the end of the day, this is how we calculate the total cost of the organization. But remember, if we want to present the information well, then the material and labor could have given us prime cost. But in this case, we were not told if it is direct or indirect, but certainly because there is overhead, that means material and labor are direct. So we could have added these and get 20 and get 10 and call it prime cost before we bring the overhead. So now we will get a total cost of $40 per unit and then $15 per unit. So that is the total cost per unit. So that is what you have to understand in relation to how the overheads will be treated. Now, when it comes to the overheads, now we know the overhead for each of the products. So we know for the desk department, and we know for the chair department. But there are what we call apportionment of the overheads. Sometimes in the organization, we have 2 departments and then we have a service department. At the end of the day, we will get a cost for all the 3 departments within the organization. So we have production department A, production department B, and then the service department. The service department can be in relation to canteen for the 2 departments. At the end of the day, the canteen total cost must be apportioned to the 2 departments, that is department A, department B, so that we can get a total cost that has been incurred for the period, because the canteen, which is the service department, doesn't exist on its own. It exists to provide service or to support the 2 production departments. So the reapportionment of the service cost to the production department cost can be in relation to 3 methods. We can use the repeated distribution method, we can use the direct method, we can use the elimination method, or we can use the algebra method. Now, I am not going to go through all these things with you because there are some things that are fundamental, but I have them in the handout, so you can go through them in the handouts, but I'm not really going to go through them, but I'm going to give you a guide on how these things will be done. The guide I want to give you is this, that for instance, a company has 2 departments. So department A and department B. And then they have a department C. Now department A and B are the production department, and the department B, C is the service department. So at the end of the day, after apportioning all the overheads, the total of the overheads for department A, let's say it's $160,000. For department B, let's say $145. And the department C, which is the service department, is $20,000. What we are saying here is that this department C doesn't exist for its own. It exists to provide services for these 2 departments. So its total cost, that is the $20,000, should be reapportioned to the departments, to department A and the department B. This reapportionment, we can use what we call the repeated distribution. The repeated distribution is where we will say that, okay, for instance, Department A uses 20% of it and Department B uses 80% of it. Or when we share the Department C, a department will also get, maybe you have two service departments. That is where we use the repeated distribution. So for instance, if you have Department D, that means we have two service departments. So when you realize that when you share one service department, the other service department will get. When you share the other service department, this service department will get. So you have to be sharing until the figure becomes insignificant or it's zero. But a straight one is that, for instance, we will say that of these total costs, Department A takes 45% and Department B takes 55%. So in that case, the reapportionment of service department, that is the Department C, will be, we will take 45% of this. So the basis is 45 is to 55. So 45% of 20,000, let me grab my Casio, 0.45 by 20, that should be 9,000. So Department A is going to have 9,000, then Department B is going to have 11,000. There is dash here. So now the total cost incurred by each department is going to be 169,000 here and then 156,000 here. So that is what you have to understand when it comes to reapportionment of service department cost. So whatever that we incur, we're going to be sharing based on the basis that the examiner has given to us. But usually it's going to be like this, and we share it and then we get a total cost. So right now, Department A total overhead is 169,000 and Department B total overhead is 156,000. That is what you must understand when it comes to apportionment of overheads. The next thing we want to do is to look at overhead absorption. I just introduced you to that by the question we solved. Overhead absorption is simply the process whereby overhead costs are allocated and apportioned to production cost centers based on the job, the process, or the unit that is produced. Now, overhead absorption sometimes is called overhead recovery. So in performing or calculating overhead absorption rates, there are 4 steps that we are going to follow. The first thing is to estimate the total overhead costs that we are going to be incurring in the period. And from the example we solved a moment ago, the total factory cost was 700,000. That's the first thing we do. Second is to estimate the activity level for the period. This could be hours, this could be units, or this could be a cost that the organization is incurring. From the question we solved, the activity level was based on labor hours, so we calculated the overhead absorption rates per hour. The third thing is to divide the estimated overhead by the budgeted activity to get the overhead absorption rates. Then you now absorb it into the cost unit by applying the overhead absorption rates. What do I really mean by this? Let me just go through what I'm saying. So all that I'm saying here is that an organization, in order to calculate the overhead absorption rate, there are 4 steps that we go through. We have to determine the total overheads for the organization for the period. Then we determine the activity that we are going to use to absorb the overheads. And so based on this, we have about 8 bases that we can use for overhead recovery or overhead absorptions. We have the calculating the overhead absorption rate as a percentage of direct cost. So we're going to calculate the percentage direct cost rate. So overhead absorption rate based on the direct cost, it's going to be the budgeted overheads, okay? Budgeted total overheads, certainly, divided by budgeted direct cost. So we multiply that by 100 and the answer we get will be X dollars, okay? it's going to be percentage. So X percent of direct cost. Now, please understand what we are doing here. When you are calculating the overhead absorption rate, you remember the example we solved, 700,000 over 140,000, we got $5 per hour. That means that we apportioned it based on the hours that were expected to be used. But when we are calculating the overhead absorption rate from the perspective of direct cost, because it is cost, we multiply it by 100. What it means is that for every figure we get, it is going to be a percentage of direct labor cost. So for instance, if your answer you get here is 5% of direct labor cost, what it means is that if you go to your cost sheet, you are going to take 5% of the actual direct labor cost. I didn't even categorize it. Direct labor cost, sorry. Direct labor cost. Direct labor cost. So it is going to be 5% of what? Direct labor cost. The second one is the percentage of direct material cost. With the direct material cost, it's going to take the same formula, budgeted overhead, right? Over this time around, budgeted direct material cost, also times what? 100. Whatever answer you get is going to be X% of direct material cost. This is X% of direct labor cost. When you do this, you get X% of direct material cost. It means that when you go to the calculation of your cost sheet, you are going to take whatever percentage. So in this case, if you got 10% of direct material cost, it means when you go to your cost sheet and you are calculating the total cost of the product, the overhead to be absorbed in this case will be 10% of the actual direct material cost that has been incurred. Then we have percentage, that overhead absorption rate based on the prime cost. Okay, based on prime cost, a percentage of prime cost. Based on prime cost is going to still, you see, all the overhead absorption rate you'll be calculating, the budgeted overhead is going to be the numerator. It is the denominator that will be changing. So based on prime cost, it is going to be your budgeted overhead still over your budgeted prime cost times 100. Now you know that your budgeted prime cost in this case is certainly going to be your direct material cost plus what? Your direct labor cost. Alright, in this case, your direct material cost, direct labor cost, but budgeted, okay, based on the budget. So whatever answer you get will be X% because times 100, X% of the actual prime cost. So when you go to the cost sheet, you're going to take X% of whatever percentage you get of the prime cost as the overhead for that period. Then we also have overhead absorption rate per hour. That is what we just calculated with the example we did. That is going to be the budgeted overhead over total budgeted hours. We have it as a rate per machine hour. That is going to be still the budgeted hours over total machine hours. Then we have rate per unit. That is if we are absorbing overheads based on the total unit that each production department produces, then it means that it is going to be the budgeted overheads over the total budgeted units. Then we are going to use that to multiply by the actual units produced by each of the departments, so we get a total cost for the organization. Now, so the choice of an absorption basis is a matter of judgment and common sense. What is required is an absorption basis which realistically relates to the characteristics of a given cost center and which avoids undue economies. So even though there are a lot of bases, you must decide what you have to use based on judgment and common sense in the organization. Now what we mean by that is that, for instance, if the organization is capital intensive, that is, you use a lot of machines in the organization, then the appropriate base for allocating overheads may be to adopt the rates per hour. So it's going to be budgeted overheads over budgeted machine hour, okay, because it's capital intensive. If it is labor intensive, we are using much labor in the organization rather than machine, then it will be good to apportion your overheads based on the labor that we employ in each of the departments. So that is going to be the budgeted overheads over the budgeted labor hours. But if the organization incurs a lot of cost in each of the department in the production of their products, then they can decide to use the direct material cost, the direct labor cost, or they can decide to use what? The prime cost. So it is a matter of judgment and common sense as a management accountant or as a manager to decide which one is appropriate and which one is realistic for the business under consideration. So let's shift down to an example that I have there. Basically, in this example, it is just like what I have done already, so I'm not going to go through it with you though, but it's a straightforward thing, but I'll discuss it with you. The budgeted production overheads and other budget data of Bridge Cottage Company are as follows. Production Department A, Production Department B. The overhead costs is $36,000 for Department A, $5,000 for Department B. Direct material cost for Department A is $32,000, none for Department B. Labor cost, only Department A, $40,000. Machine hours, only Department A, $10,000. Direct labor hours, only Department A, $18,000. Then units of production is Department B, $10,000. Calculate the overhead absorption rate using the various bases. So if you look at this, I missed my slide. If you look at this question, you realize that in the production department A, we have overhead costs there, we have direct material costs there. So some of the rates we could calculate, and we also have labor costs there, we have labor hours there. So definitely we could calculate overhead absorption rate as a percentage of direct labor cost. So we bring the budgeted labor cost. So the total overheads for the department A is 36,000, okay, 36,000, divided by the labor cost for department A is 40,000. And you know that it should be times 100. So when we do that, that should give us 90%. So it's going to be 90% of direct labor cost. What it means is that when we go to the actual cost sheet, when we are calculating the actual cost of production, you see, why we are doing all these is because of determination of the cost of the product. So if you are preparing the cost sheet, as I illustrated, when we were looking at the classification of cost, when we are preparing the cost sheet, when we bring direct material cost, direct labor cost, direct expenses, we get a prime cost. Then you realize that we bring factory overheads. So that factory overheads that you are bringing there is what is making us to do this calculation in relation to the overhead absorption rate. So after bringing those items, now if you have to absorb the overheads according to direct labor cost, then this overhead absorption rate you have calculated, that is 90% of direct labor cost. When you get to factory overheads, you're going to take 90% of the actual direct labor cost in your cost sheet, then that gives you the overheads. So that is how the overhead absorption rate is going to be used by the business. Right. Apart from these, there is also what we call the blanket overhead absorption rate, or the blanket absorption rate, and then departmental absorption rate. Blanket overhead absorption rate. Now, as the name implies, blanket. This is where you see we have two departments, but we just calculate one overhead absorption rate and we apply it to all the departments. That is what blanket absorption rate is about. But departmental absorption rate is where we calculate the overhead absorption rate for each department. Like the question we were solving now, or we were looking at now, there is a data available for department A, there is a data available for department B. So we are going to calculate departmental absorption rate. But the blanket absorption rate is where we calculate the same overhead absorption rate, but we apply it to each department in the organization. Now, one thing that we will be looking at under overhead absorption rate is the concept of over absorption and under absorption of overheads. Over absorption and under absorption of overheads. Now, what do we mean by over-absorption or under-absorption of overheads? What happens usually is that over-absorption means that the overheads charged to the cost of sales are greater than the overhead actually incurred. Then under overhead means that insufficient overhead have been charged, included, or have been included in the cost of sales. Now, let me tell you this. You realize that in the calculation of our overhead absorption rates, we are dealing with budgets. So let's say, for instance, we absorb the overheads based on the units produced. So it is going to be the budgeted overheads, okay, divided by budgeted units. So that is going to give us X dollars per unit. Now, when we calculate this overhead absorption rates, remember, this is what we are going to use in the actual cost. After getting our prime cost, overhead, this is the thing we're going to use there. So we're going to use this figure, assuming we had $3 per unit as the overhead absorption rate. Then we are going to say the overhead to be charged in the cost sheet is going to be $3 times the actual units that has been produced. So let's say that the budgeted units that was used to arrive at this $3, so let me put in some figures. Let's say the budgeted unit is 30,000, and then the budgeted overhead is 30,000, and budgeted unit is, let's say, 3,000. Let's say 3,000 units. So 30,000 over 3,000, I think that should be $10. So the overhead absorption rate is $10 per unit. This is the budget that we want to produce 3,000. So we're going to absorb the overheads using the $10 per hour. But if you look at the actual activity we undertake, A, maybe we produced only 2,500 units. And then B, we produce 4,000 units. Now, if we produce 2,500 units, but the overhead absorption rate we are using is 10,000, that means that it's $10 per unit. That means the overhead we will be charging is going to be 2,500 by 10, and that should give us $25,000. But if we are using this 10 here, this 10 was based on 3,000, but we are actually producing only 2,500. It means that we have over-absorbed the overheads. It means we have over-absorbed it. What it actually means is that ideally we should have charged only, or we should have made it 30,000 over 2,500, but we made it 30,000 over 3,000. So in this case, we have overcharged overhead. Now, if we have overcharged the overhead, then we have to now subtract it from the cost. So when we look at the difference here is 500 units. So this 500 units by 10, which is going to give us 5,000, has to be subtracted from the cost of the company. Why? Because the budgeted unit is more than the actual unit. So when the budgeted unit is more than the actual unit, that means that we have absorbed overheads. The difference is going to be a subtraction from the cost. The second scenario is that based on the budget, we wanted to produce 3,000, but the actual units we produced is 4,000. In this case, we're going to be charging overheads into the cost sheet at 40,000. But look at it. This rate we are using is based on 3,000, but the actual units we produced is 4,000. It means in this circumstance, overhead has been under-absorbed. So because it has been under-absorbed, we find a difference. When you find a difference, it is in this case 1,000 units. So this 1,000 units by $10 is going to give us 10,000. That 10,000 will be added back to cost because overhead has been under-absorbed. It should have been 30,000 over 4,000, but it was 30,000 over 3,000. So since the budgeted unit is less than the actual unit, it means that we have over-absorbed the overhead. But if the budgeted unit is more than the actual unit, it means that, no, let me take that again. If the budgeted unit is more than the actual unit, it means we have over absorbed the overhead. Okay, so we need to what? Subtract back the difference. But if the budgeted unit is less than the actual unit, it means we have under absorbed overhead, so we need to add it back. Please note, anytime you are preparing budget information, cost statement using absorption costing, the issue of over and under absorption has to be in your mind. So you must find out whether we have over absorbed or under absorbed. Assuming we were using labor hours too, the question would have been the same. If labor hours and it is 3,000 but we actually use 2,500, that means that we have over absorbed, so we subtract it. If it is labor hours and we have absorbed it based on 3,000 hours, but we actually use 4,000 hours, it means we have under absorbed, we need to add it back. So these are what you have to understand when it comes to over absorption and under absorption. So let me see if, okay, I have something else to talk about in that case. Right, so the final thing to talk about is to discuss issues about the entries that we have to make in relation to labor costs to be incurred by an organization. So let's see the question that we have here. Mallox motorcycles absorb production overheads at a rate of 0.5 per operating hour. So we've been told of the absorption rate as 0.5 per operating hour, so they are absorbing overheads based on the labor hours. And administration overheads at 20% of the production cost of sales. Right, the actual data for 1 month was as follows. So administration cost 32,000, production overheads 46,500, operating hours 90,000, production cost of sale 110,000. What entries need to be made in the overhead ledger? What entries need to be made in the overhead ledger? So in looking at this question, we have to consider the various entries that must be made in relation to the overheads. So looking at the question again, we are told of production overheads, so we're going to prepare production overheads account. So production overhead, and we are using dollars. Then we also need to prepare administration overheads because there is admin overhead there. The same thing, credits and debits. So let me divide my board. Then you need to prepare the under or over absorption account. Right, so let's see what is happening in the question. When it comes to the production overheads, we are told in the question that the organization incurred 46,500 as the actual cost for production. It means the entry for that is we credit the cash and then we debit what? The production overheads account. So we're going to debit the production overheads account with that figure that is 46,500. Then we were also told that the issue relating to, so let's go up. We are also told that production overheads are absorbed at a rate of $0.5 per unit and administration overheads are absorbed at 0.2. So to look at the overhead absorption rate in relation to the production overheads, it's going to go to the work in progress. It's going to go to the work in progress. So we're going to debit the work in progress account, then we're going to credit the production overheads account. Why? Because we are told that production overheads is absorbed 0.5 per the operating hours. So work in progress will take a share of this production overheads, and that's going to be 90,000 by $0.5. But let's see, that 90,000 by $0.5 is 45,000. So what is happening is that the actual cost we incurred is 46,500, but what is absorbed based on the overhead absorption rate is 45,000. What is happening here? What is happening here is that we have under absorbed the overheads. So when we balance this account, the difference will be the under absorbed overheads, which is going to be 1,500. I hope you get a scenario, because production overheads will be absorbed or taken to the work in progress account, right? Or with the production account. So once it is a production overhead, what we actually paid for was 46,000. But based on the overhead absorption rate of 0.5, according to the hours we used, it is going to be 45,000. Now, how do we even know that it is an under absorption? Were we giving budgeted hours in the question? Okay, we were not giving budgeted hours in the question, but looking at what has been paid and what is absorbed, the difference is under absorption of overhead. So we go to the administration overhead. The actual administration cost paid, we credit the cash book, then we debit the administration. So the actual administration paid was 32,000. Actually paid. But the one that is absorbed, we are told that the administration overhead is 20% of the production cost of sales. So if you look at the overhead that is absorbed to cost of sales, it's going to be 20%, okay? So 0.2 of cost of sales. The cost of sales is 180,000, and that leads us to 36,000. Look at what is happening. Look at what is happening. Look at what is happening. We actually incurred administrative overhead of 32,000. But what was absorbed based on the overhead absorption rate, 20% of the cost of sales is 36,000. So when you compare, you realize that in this case, there is an over absorption of overheads of 4,000. So now when I go to the over or under absorption of overheads, I simply have to what? Complete the double entry. So this is on the credit side, I bring it to the debit side from the production overheads account, 1,500. Then this is from the admin overheads. It's over provision on the debit side, so I bring it to the credit side from admin overheads of 4,000. So that is what you have to understand in relation to that. The difference will go to the profit or loss account for the year. So 4,000, 4,000. It will go to P&L as 2,500. That is the total thing. So we are saving, okay? We are saving money. We over absorb by 4,000. We under absorb by 1,500. So we are now saving the company with 2,500. This is why over absorption is always subtracted from the cost, because it is going to what? Reduce the cost that we are incurring as an organization. So that is what you have to understand. You realize the actual cost that is incurred, you look at the cost that has been absorbed, then you decide, have we under absorbed or over absorbed? The actual cost incurred, look at what is absorbed, and you ask yourself, have we over absorbed or under absorbed? So that is what you have to understand when it comes to accounting for overheads.